Hey guys, my name is Victoria, and welcome to this tutorial. Today, I will be showing you guys how to make a simple currency converter with Java, which will also involve making a simple HTTP GET request to call an API, as well as show you guys how to add a package to your Java project in order to use an external dependency. I hope you have fun, and enjoy!
Alright, so we're just going to start by creating a new project in whatever IDE you like. Here I'm using IntelliJ. You can go with all the default settings and then just give the project a handy name like currency converter, something pretty obvious for what we'll be making. And then from there, that's it. You can create the new project. So if you open the project folder to the left, you can tell that there will be all your folders, all your files, and you can see that we have an SRC folder, and that'll hold the source code. There's also external libraries, which is our SDK, and we'll add something to that later since we want to use JSON, which I'll explain later in this video. So for now, what we're going to do is we're going to add our source code folder, and you can just do that for the SRC by right-clicking it and adding Java class. So again, we'll give it the same name, currency converter, nothing too exciting, and then from there, we'll be ready to start writing code. Okay, so we're just going to start off with our public static void main, which serves as the main entry point of our program. And this is where we'll sort of have the code that kind of drives our program and sort of, directs the flow, the logic, etc. of what our currency converter is going to do. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start off with a hash map. What a hash map does is it maps a key to a value. So for this hash map here, you can see our key is going to be an integer, and the value that that integer will map to is going to be something of a string. And you'll see why we do this. Basically, what we're going to do for this program is we're going to want to map certain numbers to certain strings that are kind of going to be our currency codes. So here we're going to add our currency codes, and those will be some things that you'll be familiar with, like USD for US dollars, CAD for Canadian dollars. And really what you can do with this hash map is kind of do any mapping that you like, but for here I just came up with 5 sample currency codes that we're going to use for the sake of this converter. However, if you wanted to use any different kinds of currencies, you could just look up the 3-letter code, and then you could just add them to the hash map, and then you could use that as well to figure out what that currency conversion is going to be like. So here I decided to use US dollars, Canadian dollars, euros, Hong Kong dollars, and Indian rupees. So now with the hash map, if we pass in a key of 1, we'll get a string back, which is USD. Pass in a key of 2, we'll get a string back as CAD, etc., etc. So now we're going to make a string called from code and to code. And these are going to represent the 3 letters as above currency codes that we want to convert from and to. We're also going to make a double amount, which is the amount that we want to convert. And then also to get input, we're going to need to make a scanner. So we'll just make a new scanner. And obviously, since it's underlined red, we can use our IDE to help have us add that dependency. Just like so. Now for me, part of the fun of writing my own programs is being able to print out and see kind of whatever you want. So here we're just going to print something simple like, hey, welcome to the currency converter, but you can honestly give any greeting that you like. So just to recap sort of what we have so far, we have our hash map, which will map certain integers to our currency codes. We have an uninitialized strings, which is going to be our from code and our to code. We have our double, which is for our amount. We have our scanner, and now just some more print statements. So now we're going to ask the user what currency they would like to convert from. So for example, if you wanted to convert from Canadian dollars to US dollars, this would be where the user would select Canadian dollars. In this case, this would correspond to our code of 2, and they would enter that when prompted. You can notice that the integers here are going to be what maps with the hash map above. So if you wanted to add any new kinds of currencies, just follow the same pattern. I'm just adding extra description just for clarification for the users in case if they aren't familiar with the actual currency code. So now that we've prompted the user for what currency they want, now that we have the integer that they entered, we can use our hash map to map that to the proper currency code. The reason why we're using a hash map to do this mapping is because it's easier for the user to simply enter an integer value as opposed to the currency code itself, in case if they could be unfamiliar with it. So as you can see, what we've done here is we've asked the user what currency they wish to convert from, and we're parsing that input with the sc.nextInt, which is our scanner collecting the integer from the keyboard that the user has entered. So now what we're going to do is repeat the same thing, except do it with the currency that the user wants to convert to. So again, if I want to convert from Canadian dollars to US dollars, this is where I would select integer 1 to get US dollars. Now we're just going to prompt the user for the amount that they wish to convert, and assign this to the double amount that we made above. Notice how we're using the scanner to collect the next float, since the number that the user enters could be a decimal and might not necessarily be an integer. So at this point, we know what currency the user wants to convert from, what currency they want to convert to, and the amount. At this point, all we're sort of missing is the actual exchange rate. The way we're going to get the exchange rate is by making a GET request using an API that will give us the current exchange rate in real time. And we'll do that via HTTP. So if you can see here, I'm sort of writing a function, which is what I wish we could have that would complete our program, which would just simply be send HTTP GET request, and all it would intake would be the from code, the to code, and the amount. From there, in a sense, the currency converter is kind of done. So that's kind of only the missing piece left we have to complete. So for now, just to make sure things are on track, let's comment that out and build to make sure that there's no other errors we have to take care of before we start doing the final piece of our currency converter. All right, build is successful. So I'm just going to sort of show you guys what's an API and kind of what we're doing. So basically, we want to use a currency converter. So let's look up currency converter API and see kind of what's out there on the internet, looking for something we could use that would be useful to our program. What we want is basically if we give somebody the amount we want to convert and basically the currencies we want to convert from and to, is there somewhere that somebody could tell us what the current exchange rate is? So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm browsing different kinds of APIs, and you'll find that if you go on the internet, there's quite a vast amount of resources available. So here's one that looks good. It looks pretty easy to use. It'll give me the exchange rate, and all I can do to use it is to pass in, as part of the URL, when I make the GET request, my base currency and the currencies that I want. That sounds like all the information we have, so let's try making an HTTP GET request to use this API. So what HTTP is it stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And what basically that is it carries requests from a browser to a web server and transports information from the web server back to the requesting browser. So in the case here, I'm making the request to that API with the URL to get the currency conversion And basically using this HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, will send that request and bring the information back to me so that I can use it. So for the get URL, we're going to use the URL that the API is asking us to use, but we're going to input our own parameters, which is the from code and the to code, to make sure that we get the proper currency conversion that we want. So I'm formatting this URL basically just based from the API page that I showed you guys before on how their API works, so that way when I call this API, it'll return to me the information that we want. So in the case of the API we've chosen, base equals to code, meaning that base is the currency that we want to convert to, and symbols equals from code, meaning that when you pass in the symbols parameter to their API, that equates to the currency that you want to be converting from. So there we go. To make sure we actually have the right URL, we can actually paste what we have in our browser. So in this case, I'll just treat base as USD and symbols as CAD, and we can see if we get something returned. So as you can see, we actually do get the proper information we want. So now that we know we have the proper URL, the next steps to making a proper HTTP GET request would be to set up the actual HTTP connection. In this case, we're going to use our URL to open a connection. There are often quite a few things you might have to import, so just hover over the red and add the necessary libraries or dependencies. So what's happening here is that since the methods that we're using have the potential to throw exceptions, we have to add that to our method signature as well. So what we can see here is that using open connection has the potential to throw an IO exception. So if we click on that and we add that our own method throws an IO exception, that'll fix the error that we're seeing. Since we're making a GET request, we need to set the request method as being GET. Other HTTP methods include put and post, which involve sending data to the server, or delete, which requests deleting something from the server. But for now, we are just requesting data, which is why we're using GET. To check if our GET request was successful, we need to examine our response code. So HTTP has a lot of different kinds of response codes, all meaning different things. So what we're looking for is for a response code of OK to know that our request was successful. So as soon as we know that our GET request is successful, that means that we can now read the information on our response, which should contain what we requested. In this case, the currency conversion given the currency we want to convert from and the currency we want to convert to. To do that, we're going to use a buffered reader. So what we're going to do is we're going to read our response, and while there's still data in it, we're going to add that to our string buffer, which is sort of just like a normal string, except we can modify it, so then that way we can parse the response that we got from our request. What this while loop is going to be checking here is that while there's still stuff to read in our response, let's keep reading it. And from there, we're going to add that to our string buffer. So through our API, we can tell that the format of the data we're going to get back is going to be in JSON format, which means that we're going to somehow need to read JSON format. What is JSON format though? Basically, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a human and machine readable format to represent data that is structured. So here, this is all in JSON format. How will we parse this JSON? Luckily for us, we can use an external dependency that will do most of the work for us. Here, I'll show you how we can add this package to our project. If you care to learn more about JSON, you can just go to json.org. So to add this package, we need to download the jar file. And what the jar file is that it essentially stores the Java used for this package. So just download it from the site. So just before we add it, we can tell that if we want to use a JSON object, this time it'll be red. However, when we hover to try to resolve it, it actually can't resolve the JSON object. So to add it to our project, we're going to want to go to our project structure. There we're going to add jar file and click to where you could add it in your project. Here, I just added a lib folder where I placed the jar that I downloaded, and you could do the same for your project. But basically, it just needs to know the file path of where the jar actually is. So now instead of saying it cannot resolve JSON object, we just simply need to import the class. So that's how we know that adding the package worked. So now in the future, if you ever wanted to add a package or external dependency to your Java project, you could just do so in a similar way. Anyways, back to parsing our response. So what we're going to do is we're going to cast our response and create it to be a JSON object. To do that, we have to pass it in as a string. What we expect to be in our JSON object is the response that we got from our GET request, which we can also see right here. However, from this response, we only really just care about the conversion rate, as highlighted. So how are we going to get that? Luckily, JSON makes it really easy to get the information you want as soon as what you have is already in the JSON format. So what we want to do here is to collect the information that was in the rates section. To do that, we just get the JSON object and specify that the key is rates. And then, from the rates section itself, what we want is the currency conversion, which basically is just corresponding to the value that we get when we use our from code, which is the currency we want to convert from, as a key. Let's just add a print statement here just to make sure we're on the right track. We'll also just print out the rates JSON object to see that as well, to just make sure that we're getting values that we are expecting. So if everything works according to plan at this point, then we can print the currency converted for the user, now that we have the amount and we have the proper exchange rate. So here, the value that we want, which is basically the converted currency, is simply amount divided by exchange rate. Now, in the case that we don't get a status HTTP OK, we just need to alert the user that, hey, the GET request didn't work.
This can usually happen for a number of reasons. It could be user end, like if we had the wrong URL, or it could be server end, like if the API itself is actually down. But regardless, we need to let the user know if the request failed. Alright, so at this point the function should be done, so we can comment it back into the main class. But since we have to remember it throws an IO exception, the main function header also needs to describe how it throws an IO exception as well. So since we made quite a few changes, let's just build again to make sure it builds properly. Alright, build is successful. So in theory, everything should be sorta done, so let's just try running the program and see the console output. Alright, this looks good so far. Welcome to the currency converter, and what do we want to convert from? Let's just try US dollars, and let's say we want to convert to Canadian dollars. $55. Okay, cool. We can see though that the program is returning to us many decimal spots in the response. We kinda don't want that. If we just want to deal with money, we only need 2 decimal spots. So let's make that change. To do that, Java has this formatter called decimal format, and what we can basically do is use it to format the decimal numbers that we have. So say, if we only want 2 digits at most in the decimal spot, then we can just specify 2 digits after the decimal spot as so. Now let's be sure to add it to the string that we're printing out, so that way the user can see it. So we'll add that to our amount. And then we're going to add that to our converted currency as well. Okay, sweet. So now that we made those changes, let's just try running it again and see if we get the output as expected, where we don't have the trailing decimal. Okay, excellent. Looks about right. Sounds good. Currency converter looks like it's working. So great, in a way it's kinda done. So let's just play with it some more to make sure again that it works as expected. Well, hold up. If I enter a 6 here, that's not an option that I can use. If we keep going for that, the GET request fails because the number 6 doesn't actually map to anything that we put in the hash map as valid currency code. So let's add some checks around when we ask the user for input to make sure that they actually do enter a number between 1 and 5 to avoid the case where they enter an invalid number and cause the GET request to fail. So to do that, let's just add an integer from and to. So for now, we're just going to assign from to be the integer that the user enters. And from here, now we're just going to stay in a while loop. So we're going to check if from is less than 1 or greater than 5, i.e. not a valid number, then we're just going to keep prompting the user for more input until they eventually do enter a valid number. And then once we have that valid number, then we can map it with our hash map to get the valid currency code. We'll just reiterate the options again for the user, so that way they can easily decide which currency they're wanting to convert from. Alright, so we're going to scan the user input from the keyboard again while we're in the while loop to get the option that they've chosen and to check again that it is a valid number or not a valid number. And if it's not, then the while loop will just keep on looping against itself until they finally give a valid input. Once we know we have the valid input, we can now assign from code and map it with our hash map and get the correct currency code. And now what we did here, we're just going to repeat again, but with to and to code. Make sure whenever you're copy and pasting just to switch all the variable and other names properly, otherwise you're going to get some more errors that you probably didn't bargain for. Alright, this is looking good. Let's build it and running again to see if now if we enter an invalid number, if it'll actually catch that for us and not allow us to proceed. Alright, so if we enter a 6 again, great, it asks us to keep entering a valid number until we finally do, and then we move on. Alright, that is looking good. So what I am noticing though is that it seems to exit pretty fast. It only lets you make one conversion. What if we surrounded the whole thing in sort of like a dual while loop, so that way the user can actually keep converting different amounts, different currencies, until they specify that they're done? I feel like that would be something nice to add, so let's do that. So the part that we're gonna put in the whole do section is a part that we're just gonna keep repeating over and over. So in this case, that's mostly the whole program, so we'll surround the whole program with the do, brackets, and the while is what's gonna keep driving our program. So let's say we have some sort of condition like running that will set to true and false depending on whether user wants to keep running the program or not. And that can just be a boolean, and at first we'll set it to true. We'll assume that the user wants to keep converting currencies. So now, we have to move the thank you for using currency converter statement outside the while loop to make sure we don't keep thanking them every single time, but only after they're done and are about to exit the program. Instead, what we'll put here is prompt the user if they would like to use the currency converter again. To make it easy for the user, we can just get them to press a 1 to specify yes, and sort of anything else to just be a no, any other number, and then that way it's easy because they can just press 1 for yes and a different number for no. And then what we can simply do is just check the input that we get in a simple if statement, and if they do specify yes, then we can continue running the program. If they specify no, then we want to set running to be false. Then that way we know when the while loop executes again, running will be false and it'll break out of the program. Alright, everything's looking good. Let's build and run the program again and see if our loop works. Okay, that's looking good. It's asking us if we would like to play again, so let's say yeah. Rinse and repeat. Alright, so since we didn't enter a number, it threw an exception because the scanner is actually looking for us to enter another number. So if we just specify that the user needs to enter any other integer and that'll count as a no, then that'll fix the problem. Okay, so that sort of concludes the tutorial for the currency converter. It's fun to play around with, fun to fiddle with. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. There's a lot of freedom to adding different currencies as well. If you can easily add other currency codes to the hash map. Okay, thanks so much for watching, guys.